Hello, students. Mr. Williams back discussing the social issues of the 1980s. Again, as we've pushed and talked about, we've got major societal shifts happening from nearly every era to era, decade to decade. Lots of factors influencing that. In the 1980s, there are some specific significant shifts from some of the prior norms that were established back in the 1950s when we had that rise to affluency, okay? And I think John Green, in the video recapping the economic malaise of the 1970s, stagflation, he discussed some of these, okay? So even though we have an American resurgence and there are certain aspects of American daily life and our economy that's returning and everybody's feeling good about, there are some classic American institutions, all right, items, whether it's societally speaking or economically speaking, that suffered too much damage, and the changing times are going to forever affect and change them. First and foremost, a decline in the nuclear family. This idea of conformity in the 1950s, what some had held on to near and dear through the 60s and 70s, it's no longer stigmatized to the level that it once was. The idea of a dysfunctional or split home is no longer stigmatized or seen as such a taboo thing, okay? Traditional industries as well. We noted that over and over and over when we talked about the economic distress of the 1970s. We were behind the curve in terms of being innovative in regards to manufacturing. What built the American economy through the 1950s and through some of the 60s, manufacturing, that's significantly changing. And we're going to see an enormous shift from like physically making things to physically providing things, going from a traditional industrial makeup of manufacturing to service. Okay. And finally, the decline in consequence-free behavior. Some activities that led to the death of the hippie generation in the late 60s and early 1970s are going to kind of rear their ugly head again in the 1980s. We're going to start seeing this execution of individualistic indulgence, right? Excess, doing what you want when you want, all right? Living free and happy, enjoying yourself. We're going to see it, similar to the hippie generation, start to create a heavy cost, okay? First and foremost, the decline of the nuclear family. Divorce rates climb to nearly 50% in the 1980s, okay? And I think they've continued to hover around that number. That's unfortunate. In Nemaha County, Seneca, Kansas, this is still one of the final refuge areas for the classic picturesque American life in the 1950s, okay? We still have, for the most part, two-parent homes. There's a multitude of reasons for that, but you get outside of Nemaha County, you get outside of our little area here, it's drastically different, okay? Dysfunctional homes, dysfunctional as in a split home, right? Mom and dad don't live under the same roof and maybe have a legal divorce, multiple marriages through their lives. That's the norm. That's statistically speaking the norm. And it becomes more normal in the 1980s, all right? It grows in normality through the 60s and 70s, but social stigmas of divorce begin to disappear in the 1980s, okay? Single-parent households increased dramatically, and unfortunately, they increased dramatically in minority areas, impoverished urban minority areas. Cohabitation, waiting longer to marry, has caused divorce rates to decrease in present day, and again, kind of hover around that 50 percentile. But in the 1980s, we see a substantial decline in the mindset, the overall understanding that it is integral to a successful American society that you need a two-parent home, okay? The stigma disappears. So the darkness or the cloudiness or the judgment, the negative judgment surrounding a dysfunctional split home, that starts to disappear in the 1980s, okay? The nuclear family is no longer championed to the level it once was by the collective society in the US of A. So that's one social shift to note in the 1980s. But that's, again, slowed down, all right, a little bit here over the last 10, 15 years. Traditional industries. The American economy was always about manufacturing up until this point. From us showing up on the international stage as a big-time producer of goods back in the 19 teens. So from the 19 teens through the 1970s, we had always been built on manufacturing, but there's a change in the weather, right? We've got other nations out there around the globe now that are undercutting us in terms of manufacturing at regards to the cost, the frequency, etc. So several areas where we had always been number one, it's not necessarily the case any longer. We have to start shifting from manufacturing to service, and certain areas of manufacturing go from, industrial to more technological. We start to see a demand for skilled labor. So you have a formal training, maybe a degree or a certificate. That starts to increase, and we start to go to, like I said again, service industries from production industries. Places like Detroit, you've got square miles inside the city of Detroit now that are looking similar to the bottom two pictures here. What was once a bastion of industrial excellence is now an urban, uninhabited jungle, okay, with wild packs of dogs running around. There's some phenomenal documentaries out there you can watch on Detroit, and just the overall level of stress and decline that was experienced by this city. It was like 1.5 million at its peak in terms of population. It's like 750, 800,000 now, okay? An enormous shift due to our national industry having to shift to keep up. And that, again, greatly shifts society in general here in the US of A in the 1980s. Finally, consequence-free behavior, okay? In terms of freelance, non-protected sexual behavior that was, I don't want to say necessarily promoted, but wasn't not promoted in the late 60s through the 1970s. That's going to start getting checked in the 1980s as AIDS, okay? HIV starts to spread across the nation. Autoimmunodeficiency syndrome. HIV, that virus, actually causes that disease, that syndrome. And it was killing thousands in the 1980s. It wasn't in the US of A until the very late 70s, early 1980s. And it's seen as an epidemic. Everybody feared it, all right? It's similar kind of to the coronavirus right now, where there's a lot of doom and gloom. There's a lot of fear. Is some of it warranted? Absolutely. Is a lot of it predicated and built off of speculation and a tiny amount of data to where we don't technically, scientifically understand it yet? You bet. Okay, the AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s parallels the fear, doom, and gloom and the paranoia surrounding coronavirus right now. People didn't know that it was sexually transmitted. So people were worried about coughing on each other, rubbing up against each other. And it's just some phenomenal stuff, phenomenal stories surrounding this. The Dallas Buyers Club, a movie done by Matthew McConaughey, fabulous job kind of portraying the AIDS battle in the early 1980s, okay? It gives you some of the social stigma that was associated to it, some of the suffering emotionally, mentally, and socially that was experienced by AIDS victims, but also the efforts made by those victims and others to kind of, again, continue to try to understand it so it could be combated, all right? In addition to AIDS, there were some other, consequence-free behaviors that were getting checked. The war on drugs. We see drug usage, cocaine followed by crack, skyrocket in the 1980s and cause a lot of distress and absolute chaos amongst certain communities throughout the United States of America. You have some of these prominent cartels in South America and Central America that were making bank running cocaine north of the border. Reagan, followed by George H.W. Bush, officially launched a war on drugs. And utilizing the federal law enforcement officials that they have, trying to crack down on this illegal drug trade. Some fascinating conversations that could be had about that in terms of its fallout over the last 3 decades. But drug usage, which again wasn't promoted in the 1970s, but wasn't necessarily, outwardly frowned upon, that does get frowned upon by the nation at large. There is a stigma intentionally attached to it by elected officials, by many Americans throughout the 1980s to try to promote a drug-free lifestyle. Okay, got a clip here, CBS, sorry, not CBS, but a PBS NewsHour presentation kind of documenting, I think, the 25-year anniversary, the 30-year anniversary of the war on AIDS in San Francisco, okay? At first, it was seen as being a disease that only homosexuals could contract because it was running rampant through the gay community in the early 1980s. San Francisco was seen as one of the few places in the U.S. where you could go and outwardly be homosexual. So it was devastating to the San Franciscan community at that time. You can look this up. This is on YouTube. Again, just a fascinating little investigative piece kind of documenting that situation in American history. You can watch plenty of them again about the war on drugs. Oprah had some phenomenal commentary throughout the 80s and early 90s in regards to the AIDS epidemic as we continue to gain understanding. But nevertheless, this does it for some of the social issues experienced in the 1980s. All right. In review, we're talking about a gigantic shift in the overall acceptance of the nuclear family. Like, is it necessary for our nation to remain extremely efficient and successful? Is the nuclear family necessary? We felt like it was in the 1950s. Is it necessary any further? In the 1980s, we start to see that shift. We start to see a destigmatizing of the split dysfunctional home. Okay, so the nuclear family is no longer championed and necessarily pushed for during the decade. That causes a shift in society. In terms of the economy, what jobs people are filling, how we move from manufacturing to service, that's going to push some societal shifts enormously. And then some general behaviors, okay? The AIDS epidemic was huge. The war on drugs was big. Those were some prominent social issues that were, again, captivating our society throughout the decade. We'll talk about Reagan and the Cold War and lead into the 1988, 1992 elections, all right? Talk about getting into the 90s, okay, in our next couple of subsections. Later.